Imagine, all your life you've been suffering. There's pressure on your shoulders to perform, to outdo everyone else. Nothing you ever do or say is good enough. And slowly, everything you live for is wasting away. Your mother doesn't care. You just want to be creative and free, but she just wants you to be an engineer. When you finally escape and get out, find love, that love leaves you in return. And once again, you're left with nothing. Time after time, life is against you. You lose that which you hold most dear. Until one day, two little goblins arrive, and there's a quiet before the storm. Nothing lasts forever though, and it's all too much. The visions in your head intensify, and once again, you are gripped by the one that started it all. This is the breakdown of that monster. Before we start this episode, I want to give you all a content warning, so if that is in any way triggering to you, please do not listen to this episode or don't watch it if you're watching this on YouTube. Please click off and take care of yourself first. Hey, what's up everyone, and welcome to the Ben van Alles podcast, the show where we talk about a lot of things, more specifically movies and video games and what they can teach us in everyday life. I'm your host Ben, neurodivergent mess, member of the LGBT plus community, dinosaur enthusiast, and honestly, way too much into Marvel. Today, we're breaking down the Mad Hunter of the Tell Me Why video game. So let's get into it. So before we can get into what the Mad Hunter is and what it represents, I want to talk to you a little bit about PTSD and generational trauma, because that is something that we need to understand before we can understand the Mad Hunter. Now, PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's a condition of the body where the body is unable to cope with trauma that occurred. And it is that response that actually causes PTSD. It's not necessarily the traumatic event itself that causes it, but the response of the body. If the body is unable to process it properly, that is what causes the PTSD. Because actually for most people that undergo a traumatic event, they process it just fine. There's really nothing holding them back for full recovery. In people with PTSD, however, that processing didn't happen correctly. So the brain keeps trying to bring it back up. And that causes the reliving of memories and the reliving of flashbacks. It causes the body to give a response that is exactly the same response as it did during the trauma. For me personally, I have PTSD. And one of my flashback responses is the inability to breathe and a big pressure on my chest. Like, I'm not going to go into it why that is. It is also for me a overwhelming fear and the need to cry out about things. And honestly, that's really hard to deal with. And my body keeps trying to bring it back up because it doesn't know how to deal with it. So it keeps trying and keeps trying and it keeps trying. And that is what we see as flashbacks. So it's not necessarily that you keep reliving an exact memory of that event. It's more that your body tries to reprocess it and brings you through the event in your bodily reactions and in your emotions. That is what we mean with flashbacks. Another thing that the body does in order to cope with it is put itself and its autonomic nervous system in a constant state of fight or flight. It does this by raising cortisol. And what actually happens is the body overactivates your amygdala and underactivates your hippocampus, so that the cortisol level is actually no longer regulated. It just keeps climbing because the hippocampus is the organ that tells the body, hey, wait a second, there's too much stress hormone and there's too much adrenaline, you need to calm down. In individuals with PTSD, that last one doesn't happen anymore. So we are constantly in a state of fight and flight. We are constantly trying to escape our bodies and escape our memories, as it were. So that's basically what PTSD does. It also creates a disrupted autonomic nervous system, or an ANS. So it disrupts most neuropathic ways in your body that make sure that you stay in that fight or flight. So safe situations are now viewed upon as dangerous situations, and situations with family can also be really stressful. A second thing that can happen is that we become completely emotionally numb to all of it because it's just so much, and we don't know how to process all of this stress and all of these reactions, so we just sort of shut down. Another thing that might happen, and that is actually true for about 30 to 40% of people with ADHD, is that the body may develop psychosis. Now, psychosis is a condition that affects the way your brain processes information, which is already disrupted in PTSD. But in psychosis, it causes you to lose touch with some reality, or causes you to hear or see things that aren't actually there. So you might suddenly start hearing a voice, or suddenly see people standing in the room with you, but they're not actually there. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you no longer recognize these things as real. As a matter of fact, most people with PTSD actually do recognize that what is happening to them is not real, but it can make it much more difficult to recognize it. And like I said, that happens in about 30 to 40% of all people with PTSD, including myself. I've heard voices, and it's been really hard for me to get over that, and it only made my symptoms much more worse. Thankfully, I'm now on medication, and the medication helps me with regulating my cortisol levels and helps me regulate the neural pathways in my body. So I'm actually doing it quite a bit better. But for someone who's not medicated, these symptoms can only get worse. And that is something that we desperately need to address, especially in the US, where mental health is honestly not the best. So yeah, that's definitely something we need to look into. Now, there's also a thing known as generational trauma. And the thing about trauma is that it can be passed down from generation to generation. And the studies that have shown this were actually done on Holocaust survivors. And it was there seen that people were passing on the same genetic markers and the same traumatic experiences from father to son to grandson. So it's in about 3 generations that trauma can still have an impact. And that is huge, because it doesn't just mean that when you go through a traumatic event that is so life altering that it alters your whole perception of life, it doesn't just mean that it will affect just you, but it might also affect your children or even your grandchildren. That is how impactful and how scary generational trauma actually is. Now, why have I been talking about this throughout this episode so far? Well, it's because PTSD and generational trauma are actually at the forefront of Tell Me Why. And here's why. Now, in order to understand why, we need to talk about Mary Ann's story. So the story of Mary Ann Ronan, Tyler and Allison's mother. Her story is that she escaped an abusive home and an over-controlling and stern mother who was emotionally and vocally abusive towards her and tried to pressure her into doing things that she clearly didn't want to do. She then struggled to find her own way and place, fell in love with a man named Brent, who was an artist, ran away with him, and then was left by Brent when he found out she was pregnant. And we know all of this because of what Mary Ann left for Tyler and Allison in the attic. Like the whole scenes we see there, if you go through them, you actually get to know her story. So yeah, it turns out she was pregnant with her first child, Leo. She did tell her parents about it, but then, made sure to cut off all ties before Leo was born. And she actually escaped to Juneau, where she lived in a commune for a bit and then went to work for a watchmaker. And after that, after she had gained enough money from the watchmaker job, she bought the house in Dallas Crossing. Not long after, she met Carol, Eddie's mother, and Sam. Yeah, so what we know about those scenes is that the Mad Hunter is actually depicted in the first scene, and he still has 2 hands, and we see the princess standing behind a tree. What this actually means is that when Mary Ann ran away from her mother, the Mad Hunter still had his grip on her with both hands. And the further she got away from her parents and the further she got through life, the Mad Hunter actually lost a hand because of what the 2 goblins did to him. So the Mad Hunter lost its grip on Mary Ann. That's a bit what we can determine from the visual storytelling that is going on there. But to further get into Marianne's story, we actually also know that her father was abusive and unsupportive as well. We see that in the letter that he wrote to Marianne and that she's kept in the attic. So after she had Leo, we actually know through the poem of the story of the princess's loss that Leo got sick at some point and unfortunately he died. Which was again a very traumatic event for her. So we have someone who went from one traumatic event to another, and who has been through traumatic events for most of her life, and then all of a sudden she lost her first child. That broke her, and that is a story that we definitely see in the princess's loss, which is depicted in the game itself. And it was through that loss and through that pain that she actually reached out to the people in Dallas Crossing and they tried to help her as best as they could. But it also ensured that Tom, the twins' father, could prey upon Marianne and then get her pregnant, even though he was married to Tessa at the time. So at that point, Marianne got pregnant with the twins, and that is actually the story of when the princess met the two little goblins that we see. And through her stories, we are told the twins growing up and how she experienced that and what they all went through. And it's actually quite a beautiful story. And it is through the birth of the twins that the Mad Hunter lost his hand again. Or that the Mad Hunter lost his hand. So what we can determine is that the twins actually made sure that the Mad Hunter did not keep its grip on Marianne. And from that point on, they had a fairly quiet and a very good life. They were struggling a bit, of course, because in-game we hear people say multiple times that she was poor, that she was struggling, that she was dealing with her mental health, she was dealing poorly. And considering everything that she's been through so far, that's not that surprising, especially since she had no way of reaching out to a therapist or to reach out to people around her because they weren't qualified enough to help her. They tried in their own way, but nobody really could because of everything that had happened to her. And that eventually brings us to of Marianne trying to process the stories through trauma and how she built the attic and the door. I think they were built around the same time, and I think Sam did help her to some extent with the building, maybe in little bits and pieces with woodworking and that kind of thing. But I think that's about the time when the attic was actually built. I don't think it was built right before the events that we see in That Fateful Night, but I think it was built sometime before that. So Marianne was already planning on showing her kids her stories, perhaps after she herself had died or when she thought the time was right, before the events of that night. I don't think the attic and that night are that closely intertwined. I think the attic itself happened long before that. But yeah, we see her processing her trauma through that way. And another thing that we also do see is that Tessa then tried to help Marianne as best as she could. She tried to feed her, she tried to get her to interact with the community. And I think Tessa at that point already kind of knew that her husband was the father of the twins, but she didn't really let it on. And eventually there was a big fight about it, as evidenced by what Tyler and Allison are saying and what Tessa herself is saying. And I think that for Marianne, that was sort of the last drop, especially when Tessa then turned on her, called the police, and the police had to call child services on her. Once Marianne learned of that fact, all bets were off, so to speak. That is the time when she snapped again, when everything just became way too much for her. And I think that her trauma re-gripped her to the point where the Mad Hunter regained his hand and grabbed her on both sides. And that is, of course, the fateful night that we see at the start of the game. And I think that Marianne was going through a combination of psychosis and trauma-driven insanity, which eventually led her to wanting to take her own life and take her children with her, because she couldn't bear to lose another child. She couldn't bear to have her twins taken away from her and then stay behind. And she also couldn't bear to just take her own life and then not do something for her twins. Like, she couldn't leave them in the hands of the people that had betrayed her, and she couldn't leave them in the hands of a system that didn't know how special they were. I think that Marianne in her own way tried to justify what she was about to do in that way. But I also think that Tyler coming up to her that night and Tyler interrupting her rambling and her ideas also made her snap out of it just a little bit. And we kind of see that in her interactions with Tyler and Mary Ann's mind as she starts to ramble, like, they made me do it. It is his fault. She's not talking to Tyler at that point, but she's talking in herself. She's loading her weapon, and from that point on, everything that happens after is more in a startled reaction. And I think Marianne just was so far gone that she ran after her child with a gun in her hands, which is of course not a very good thing to do. But I think she was so caught up in her own mind and in her own ways that she could no longer think clearly. And that's very much what we see. And I think the truth of the night of when she ran after Tyler with a gun in her hands is somewhere in the middle. I think both Tom and Tyler are right in this case. I think that Mary Ann definitely tried to take the lives of children and then her own life. And I think that on the docks, when she saw Tyler begging for his life, she also kind of made up her mind, or she hesitated, like, I'm not going to hurt you. I think the truth of that night is actually in the middle. So what does that all have to do with the Mad Hunter? Well, if you've been paying attention, you'll hear me referring to the Mad Hunter as trauma. And I think very much the Mad Hunter itself represents unresolved trauma. And the way that she talks about the Mad Hunter losing a hand and then regaining it is very much about her trauma losing some of its grip and then regaining that grip. So it's very much, the more whole the Mad Hunter was, the bigger her trauma and the more enveloped she was in that trauma. And I think that's very much the core essence of what the Mad Hunter represents. And that's something that we really need to keep in mind when looking at the whole story. So what is the Mad Hunter? The Mad Hunter represents unresolved trauma. And I think that the reason that Allison and Tyler also see the Mad Hunter is because Marianne passed that trauma on to her children. Her unresolved trauma was passed down as generational trauma to her own children. And that is, of course, honestly, that's kind of horrifying if you really think about it. So yeah, I think very much that is what the Mad Hunter represents, and that is also the reason why Tyler and Allison can see the Mad Hunter, because he's unresolved trauma. Now, the game also closes with a message that only acceptance of that your trauma and acceptance of grief can make it so that you can heal and that you can move on from your trauma, especially if you also get a good support system and therapy. All of that messaging combined tells us a story that that you can always heal from trauma if you have the following things, and that if it doesn't happen, the trauma can have such a great impact on you that it unfortunately can go very wrong as well. And I think it does that message rather well. And also that if you don't get help for your trauma, then that trauma might recycle and come back into your children or your grandchildren, and that's how we get generational trauma. And sometimes trauma is just too big and it happens anyway. But I think the game very much tells us a story that we need mental health services and we need to take it more seriously. Now that we've talked about some very, very, very dark discussions over here, I want to bring a little bit more lightness into this episode, and I want to share with you some fun facts about twins. A rare thing that can actually happen with assigned male at birth people is that one of the identical twins misses a Y chromosome. So one of the Y chromosomes actually disappears or doesn't activate, and that embryo itself develops as female further on, because that's more or less the default of embryos. We are all female at some point. So it is very rare, like only 0.1% of all twins are this type of twin, but that can actually happen, to have an identical twin where one is assigned male at birth and the other one is assigned female at birth. It's fascinating. It's extraordinarily rare, but it can happen. So that's one of the things that I learned. Another thing, in the game itself, we learn about twin bonds and how that looks like for Tyler and Allison. In reality, it's not quite that telepathic. As far as research shows now, the twin bond is far more empathic, so they are just very well in tune with one another and they can sort of feel what the other is feeling to a certain extent, but it's nowhere near telepathic, as some anecdotal evidence tends to suggest. So I thought that was very interesting, and it's just a random, more lighter fact that I wanted to throw in, because this was a pretty heavy episode so far. So yeah, I this was really well needed. And there's a last little bit of a message that I also want to leave off with, because this episode was so heavy. First of all, if you need any help, please look for your local hotlines. They can help you if you are in need. Survival is rebellion. The best thing you can do to show the people that hurt you, or to show the people that shunned you for who you are, is to survive. But for now, I just want to say, please keep fighting. You are worthy and you matter as a person. You as a person, no matter what your trauma, no matter who you are, no matter what you've been through, you matter. You are valid and we hear you. And please keep fighting, and please keep telling yourself survival is rebellion. And I really hope that you'll stick with us for a very long time. Alright. That was really heavy. I want to thank you all for listening to the Band Van Alles podcast. I hope that you liked the episode and that you learned from it. And I will see you all again for the next one. Don't forget to rate or review my podcast on my website or on Podchaser. It would help me out a lot. And also share the episode if you enjoyed it. Tell your friends, tell people around that the podcast is here and you can listen to it. And you can also go to my website if you want to support me, leave me a review, share episodes, all that kind of thing. And it's benvanellespodcast.com. You can come chat with me on Tumblr, where my handle is benvanellespodcast. Or you can support me on Ko-fi, where my handle is Ben Van Alles. That's also the same handle that I have on Instagram and Twitter. So you can come hang out with me there. I'm not there as much as I am on Tumblr, but I would love to see you there. And for now, this is Ben signing off, and I hope I will see you all again next week. Thank you.